All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video with Mr. Kenton for physical science. Glad you're with me today. We're going to be continuing our videos that are going through the naming of compounds, and we're going to shift gears now and talk about covalent naming. Right? If you think about the last video, we looked at ionic naming, where we were looking at it at elements or compounds that contain metals and nonmetals. Well, today we're going to look at how do we properly name compounds that contain two nonmetals. Now, the nice thing about this one, ladies and gentlemen, is that all these compounds that we're going to be naming will always have two elements, right? And they'll both be nonmetals. So that's how we can make our distinction between ionic naming and covalent naming, right? But that's always got to be the first thing, is it ionic or covalent, so that we can use the right rules. Let's go ahead and dive right into this, all right? So just like there were rules for ionic, there are some specific rules for covalent. There are going to be some similarities, but there are also going to be some differences, and we need to make sure that we understand those. Right? So the first thing that we're going to do, just like we did last time, we're going to write the names of both elements in the order that they are shown in the chemical formula, right? Just like with an ionic substance. So you write the names of both of the elements just like they're written on the periodic table. That's step one. Step two, we're going to change the second element's ending to IDE, right? And you might be thinking, well, Mr. Kenton, sounds exactly like what we were doing before. And thus far, that's absolutely true. So the second step, we've written both of our elements in the order they're shown. Then we write the second element and we change its ending to IDE. That's step two, right? Step three, this is where we start to see some differences. So here, unlike with ionic substances, covalent substances require the use of Greek prefixes to communicate the number of each element that are shown in the chemical formula, right? And we will talk about those Greek prefixes on the next slide before we look at some examples. So step three is we're going to add the Greek prefix to note the number of each element that's shown in our chemical formula. Right? So that's step three. And then step four, right? If there is only one of the first element, it doesn't need a Greek prefix. So if you wrote the name and you wrote the prefix with it and there was only one of it and it's the first element, you can simply take the Greek prefix off of the first element only if it's there's only one of that element, right? And so these are the four rules that we have to keep in mind when we're going through and we're naming covalent substances, okay? Those are the four steps, right? So they're listed right there. Now, let's talk about step number three. Let's talk about those Greek prefixes that you guys are going to need to know in order to properly name things, right? So, like we said, when naming a molecular compound or a covalent compound, we have to use Greek prefixes to tell us the number of that atom that's present in the compound. And so this is just a list. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly so that we can start to look at some examples. So if you've got one of something, we're going to use the prefix mono. If you got two of something, you're going to use the prefix di. If you've got three of something, we're going to use the prefix tri. Right? If you've got four of something, you're going to use the prefix tetra. If you've got five of something, you're going to use the prefix penta. If you've got six of something, we're going to use the prefix hexa. If you've got seven of an atom, we're going to use the prefix hepta. And if there's eight of something, we're going to use the prefix octa. Now, as I'm thinking through this, one thing that I want to mention, I used the word prefix, right? And a prefix is something that is added to the beginning of the name, right? anything but prefix, something that comes before something. All right. Think about pre-order. Let's say you wanted to pre-order the latest, I don't know, Madden football game or NBA 2K, right? You pre-order it. Doesn't mean that you have it yet. You place that order ahead of time so that you can get it later. Well, with a prefix, it's something that you put ahead of or before the name of whatever it is that you're adding that prefix to, right? And so mono, di, tri, tetra, penta, hexa, hepta, and octa will all go in front of our element name. All right. So now that we've got these prefixes, let's walk through some examples. I got 3 examples for us to walk through of how we would use the covalent naming rules and these prefixes to come up with the names for covalent compounds. All right, so let's take a look at our first one. Now, we got H2O. Now, the thing I want us to key in on here, we know this is covalent because it contains 2 atoms and they're both nonmetals, right? So that's kind of the first thing. Because we've identified them as being both nonmetals, that cues you and I in, oh, I need to use the covalent rules, not the ionic ones. So if we think about it, step 1 is we write the name of both elements in the order that they're shown. So we got H and O. So we've got hydrogen, oxygen, right? That's simply the names of both of those elements. H and O are hydrogen and oxygen respectively. That's step 1. Step 2, we need to change the second element's ending to IDE. We've seen this one before. We're going to drop the YG in. So this is now going to become hydrogen oxide, right? So again, we changed that ending of oxygen to IDE. And notice we only did that to the second element, not the first. We didn't do anything to the first. We just wrote it as is. All right, step 3, we're going to add the Greek prefixes to note the number of each element that we have. Well, looking at the chemical formula, this 2 corresponds to hydrogen. So I have 2 hydrogens, so I need the Greek prefix di. Now, so this is going to be dihydrogen. And then for oxygen, there is no subscript there, so that's letting me know that there's just one of them. So this is dihydrogen monoxide. Now you might be thinking to yourselves, Mr. Kenton, the prefix is mono, and you just wrote monoxide. So when you run into this situation where you would have 2 vowels, for example, like with this, if I were to write it as it would be spelled, it would be monoxide, right? You see this double O here? That doesn't look very good and it sounds really funky, right? Monoxide. And so what chemists have done is they said, okay, what we're going to do is we're just going to simply drop one of these O's and make it monoxide. So obviously you wouldn't see this. That's not what you would use. You'd go to the monoxide portion. Now, for this particular case, there were 2 of the first element. It wasn't just 1. So we do need that Greek prefix. So if we look at it, the formal chemical name for H2O is dihydrogen monoxide. Now, the other thing that we need to keep in mind here, dihydrogen monoxide, we don't typically say that because this is simply water, right? But if you were asked to give its official covalent name, it would be dihydrogen monoxide. All right, that's the first example. Let's take a look at a second one. All right, we got CO. Again, it's covalent. We've got carbon and oxygen. They're both nonmetals. We want to split that in half so we can identify what are the two elements. So you got C and O. Now, first thing we're going to want to do, write the names of both elements in the order that they are shown. So we've identified this as carbon and oxygen. So we've got carbon, oxygen, right? That's step one. Step two, we need to change the ending of the second element to IDE. So this is now going to be carbon oxide. Third step, we need to add the Greek prefix to indicate the number that we have of each. Now, we got one carbon and one oxygen each, so we're going to need the prefix mono. So then we're going to have monocarbon monoxide. So we added our two prefixes to both of them to note the number of each. And then our last step, because there's only one carbon, we actually don't need the prefix mono, so we can simply write this as carbon monoxide. So that would be the correct name for the chemical compound that is CO. Right? So CO would be carbon monoxide. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's take a look at our last example here. CO2. So again, we want to do the same thing. We want to identify, are there two nonmetals? Yes. And then we want to split the chemical formula in half. So you got C and O, so we can identify the two elements. First things first, write the names of them. So we got carbon and oxygen again. Change the second to IDE. So we got carbon oxide. Add our Greek prefixes. Now here we have a difference. We've got one carbon, so it's going to be monocarbon. We got two oxygens, so that means dioxide. So we got dioxide. Now notice here we did include the two vowels. The two vowel thing like we saw with, I believe it was the monoxide. It's when your prefix ends in an A or an O, right? So monocarbon dioxide. And then the last step, since there's one carbon, we don't need the prefix mono. And so now this simply becomes carbon dioxide. That would be the correct name for that particular chemical formula. Okay. All right. So that, ladies and gentlemen, those are the rules that we would use to name covalent compounds. And again, I'm not necessarily asking you to always write out all four of these steps, but it's a good thing to walk yourself through. As you're first doing this, write out all these steps and kind of go through those changes until it becomes natural, because then eventually what you can start doing is you can do these things in your head. You could say, okay, looking at the periodic table, I've identified my two elements, check. I need to change the second element's ending to IDE, check. I added my prefixes, check. Oh, look, my first one only has one element. I don't need a prefix, so let's drop it. And then we write it down and we get that carbon dioxide, check, right? So thank you guys for tuning in with me and looking at this video on how to name covalent compounds. Hope it was helpful. Please make sure that you work on the practice that asks you to, you're given chemical formulas, identify the name of them using these rules. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to ask, and I look forward to seeing you guys again soon. Take care.